Story 1. I was driving down a long, empty highway late at night, feeling more tired than I had ever been. The road stretched out in front of me, dark and endless, with no other cars in sight. My eyes were dry, and it was getting harder to keep them open. I reached for the water bottle beside me, splashing some on my face, hoping it would help me stay awake. It worked for a moment, but the drowsiness kept creeping back. The only sound was the steady hum of the truck engine, and the only light came from my headlights cutting through the darkness. The night felt heavy, pressing down on me as I drove through the silence. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was off. Every now and then, I thought I saw shadows moving just beyond the reach of my lights, but I told myself it was just my imagination. I had been on the road for too long, and my mind was starting to play tricks on me. I tried to focus on the road ahead, telling myself it was just another late-night drive like so many before. I took another sip of water and nearly choked when I saw something up ahead. A figure was standing in the middle of the road, appearing out of nowhere. My heart jumped, and I hit the brakes hard, the tires screeching against the pavement. As the truck slowed down, I could make out more details. The person was dressed in black from head to toe, with a long scarf wrapped tightly around their neck. Something about their posture felt wrong, unnatural. But the strangest thing was their face. I couldn't see it clearly. It was just a blur, like looking at a smudged photograph. I sat frozen for a moment, staring at the figure. My first instinct was to roll down the window and ask if they needed help, but before I could do anything, they turned sharply and ran into the woods beside the road. The way they moved sent a chill down my spine, quick and silent, like they had been waiting for me. I felt a sudden urge to get out of there. Without thinking twice, I pressed my foot down on the gas and drove away, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that stuck with me. Even as I put more distance between myself and that spot, I couldn't stop looking in my mirrors. The road behind me was empty, but it felt like something was still there, watching. I told myself it was nothing, just a tired mind seeing things that weren't really there. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. I tried to push the thought of the strange figure out of my mind and focus on the road ahead. The highway stretched on, empty and silent, but my heart was still racing. Every shadow cast by the headlights seemed to shift and move, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My hands tightened on the wheel, and I forced myself to take deep breaths, telling myself it was just exhaustion playing tricks on me. A few minutes passed, and I started to feel a little calmer, but then, out of nowhere, something darted across the road in front of me. It moved too fast for me to react, just a dark blur disappearing into the woods on the other side. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer, but as I got closer to where it had crossed, a horrible realization hit me. It looked like another person. I didn't even tap the brakes this time. I just kept going, my pulse pounding in my ears. The road ahead felt darker now, the silence heavier. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. There were still 40 minutes left before I reached my destination, but suddenly, it felt like I wouldn't make it. My eyelids were growing heavier, and I caught myself swerving into the other lane more than once. My body was screaming for rest, but I was too afraid to stop. I couldn't shake the memory of that figure on the road, the way it vanished into the woods without a sound. Despite my fear, I knew I couldn't keep driving like this. I scanned the sides of the road, looking for a safe place to pull over. Finally, I spotted a small gravel opening, just a little rest stop meant for trucks like mine. It wasn't much, just enough space to park, surrounded by thick trees that seemed to swallow the light from my headlights. I pulled the truck in and turned off the engine. The silence that followed was deafening. Leaning back in my seat, I let out a shaky breath. I told myself I just needed a quick rest, just enough to stay awake for the final stretch. My eyes drifted shut, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in my gut. Something about stopping here felt wrong, but I was too exhausted to care. Within minutes, I was asleep. It felt like I had barely closed my eyes when I jolted awake, heart hammering in my chest. I wasn't sure what woke me. There was no sound, no movement, just a deep, unsettling feeling that something was wrong. My fingers trembled as I reached for the headlights, and when they flickered on, my blood ran cold. There he was, the man in the black scarf standing right in front of my truck. His face was no longer a blur. I could see him clearly now, his wide, unnerving smile and eyes stretched open far too wide, staring directly at me. For a few seconds I couldn't move. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the man standing in front of my truck. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stood there, staring straight through the windshield with those unnaturally wide eyes and that eerie, stretched smile. The black scarf wrapped tightly around his long neck looked even darker under the glare of my headlights, and for a terrifying moment I wondered if I had seen him breathe at all. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, trying to start the engine. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. The truck's engine sputtered once, twice, and then roared to life. Still, the man didn't move. His head tilted slightly like he was amused by my panic. I gripped the steering wheel tightly and threw the truck into reverse, my tires kicking up gravel as I backed out of the rest stop. I kept my eyes on him, half expecting him to lunge at the truck, but he just stood there, smiling, watching. The moment I turned the wheel and pulled back onto the highway, I pressed the gas pedal down hard. The truck roared forward, and in the side mirror, I saw him slowly fading into the distance, still standing there, still watching. I didn't know what to think. My whole body was tense, my mind racing with questions I didn't want answers to. How had he gotten here? I had seen him miles back on the road. There was no way he could have traveled that far on foot. I tried to convince myself it was some kind of prank, maybe a hitchhiker messing with me, but deep down, I knew better. Something about him wasn't normal. As I sped down the empty road, I kept glancing at my mirrors, half expecting to see him appear again. Every shadow along the side of the road looked like it could be him, standing just beyond the reach of my headlights, waiting. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, that I was just exhausted, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. After a few miles, I forced myself to calm down. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I needed to pull over somewhere safer and get some real sleep. But deep inside, a voice whispered that stopping again would be the worst mistake I could make. With every passing mile, I felt more trapped in the night, swallowed by the darkness that stretched on forever. No streetlights, no other cars, just me and whatever was lurking out there. I kept my foot on the gas, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. My eyes darted between the road ahead and the mirrors, scanning for any sign of him. The highway stretched on, dark and empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, somewhere, watching me. The road felt endless, the silence heavier than ever. I tried to focus, to convince myself that it was over, but then a movement caught my eye. My stomach dropped. In the side mirror, I saw something. At first it was just a shadow, barely visible in the dim light, but then I realized it was him. The man in the black scarf was running alongside the truck, keeping pace with me, his feet barely touching the ground, his eyes locked onto mine through the mirror, and that unsettling grin stretched even wider. I panicked. My foot pressed harder on the gas pedal, and the truck roared as it picked up speed. But no matter how fast I went, he stayed right there, moving effortlessly, his figure blending into the darkness. I could feel my chest tightening, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. This wasn't possible. No human could run like that. No human could move that fast. Suddenly, the headlights flickered, and for a split second, everything went dark. My heart nearly stopped. When the lights came back on, he was gone. I swallowed hard, my hands trembling on the wheel. I didn't dare slow down. My entire body screamed for me to get away, to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever that thing was. The road twisted through a patch of dense trees, and I forced myself to stay focused. But then I heard it, a low whisper, just beyond the hum of the engine. It was faint, but unmistakable. My name. My blood ran cold. I knew I hadn't imagined it. Suddenly, a figure darted across the road ahead of me. I swerved violently, barely avoiding the ditch on the side of the road. My heart pounded in my ears as I struggled to regain control of the truck. I didn't stop. I didn't even think about it. I just kept driving, pushing the truck to its limits, desperate to get away from whatever was out there. As the miles passed, I slowly started to regain my composure. My mind raced with questions. Who or what was that man? Was he even human? I glanced at the clock. I was almost there, just a little longer. I forced myself to keep going, telling myself I'd be safe once I reached my destination. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't running from him anymore. I was running towards something worse. After what felt like an eternity, I finally saw the glow of the truck stoplights in the distance. My entire body ached with exhaustion, but relief washed over me. I told myself that once I reached the parking lot, I'd be safe. The feeling of being watched still clung to me, but I tried to ignore it, focusing on the destination ahead. The truck stop looked deserted, with only a few parked rigs and the occasional flickering light in the lot. I pulled into an empty space, turned off the engine, and let out a shaky breath. The silence that followed felt almost too quiet, but I forced myself to believe it was over. Locking the doors, I leaned back in my seat and closed my eyes, hoping for a moment of rest. The familiar hum of distant highway noise filled the air, and for the first time in hours, I felt a little safer. But just as I was drifting off, a cold shiver ran down my spine. That uneasy feeling was back, stronger than before. My eyes snapped open, and my stomach twisted in fear. I didn't want to look, but something compelled me to. Slowly, I turned my head toward the windshield. There he was, standing under the dim truck stoplights, staring right at me, was the man in the black scarf. His wide, unnatural grin stretched across his face, and his eyes, those wide, lifeless eyes, were locked onto mine. My chest tightened, and I felt paralyzed. He didn't move, didn't blink. He just stood there, as if he had been waiting for me all along. My hands fumbled for the keys, but they slipped from my grasp, falling to the floor. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to grab them, my breathing ragged and uneven. When I finally looked up again, he was gone. I scanned the parking lot frantically, but there was no sign of him. I didn't wait to think. I started the truck and drove off without a second thought, leaving the truck stop behind. I drove straight through the night, not stopping until I reached my final destination. Even then, sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face staring back at me. That awful grin burned into my memory. To this day, I don't know what I saw that night. Maybe it was exhaustion playing tricks on me, or maybe, just maybe, there was something out there that night, something not meant to be seen. But one thing is for sure, I'll never take that route again. Story 2. The road stretched endlessly in front of me, dark and empty, with only my headlights cutting through the thick winter fog. I was on my last delivery for the night, and I couldn't wait to be done. The houses on this street were far apart, barely visible behind overgrown trees and broken fences. The GPS screen flickered for a moment before showing the next turn, leading me deeper into the desolate neighborhood. I glanced at the package sitting in the passenger seat. The delivery note was clear. Do not leave the package outside. Hand it to the owner. That was strange. Most people didn't care where I left their packages, especially this late at night. As I drove further, the streetlights became fewer and the houses more run down. Finally, the GPS beeped, signaling that I had arrived at my destination. I pulled up in front of an old house standing alone at the end of the road. It looked different from the others, larger but falling apart, with peeling paint and boarded-up windows. I stepped out of the truck, the freezing wind biting at my skin. The house loomed over me, dark and silent. Something about it made me hesitate, but I shook the feeling off. I had been on the road too long, and my mind was probably just tired. As I approached the front door, I noticed it was slightly open, swinging back and forth with a low creak. My gut told me to leave the package on the porch and walk away, but the instructions were clear. I knocked on the door lightly, but there was no response. I knocked again, harder this time, and after a long pause, a faint voice came from inside. "Come in," it whispered, barely louder than the wind. A cold shiver ran down my spine, but I told myself it was just my imagination. I pushed the door open a little more and stepped inside. The air inside was stale and heavy, carrying a damp, musty smell that made my stomach turn. The living room was dimly lit by an old lamp in the corner, casting long shadows across the cracked walls. My eyes wandered over the dusty furniture and the framed photos hanging on the walls. Something about them felt off. I took a closer look and realized all the faces in the pictures had been scratched out. I swallowed hard, feeling the unease build inside me. Somewhere upstairs, a floorboard creaked. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't sure if I wanted to go any further, but I had to finish the delivery. Clutching the package tightly, I took a slow step forward, trying to shake off the nagging feeling that I wasn't alone. I took a hesitant step deeper into the house, my footsteps echoing softly against the wooden floor. The dim light barely reached the far corners of the room, where the shadows seemed to stretch and shift unnaturally. The heavy scent of dust and mildew filled my nose, making it hard to breathe. I glanced down at the package in my hands, hoping to drop it off quickly and get out of there, but the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine wouldn't go away. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. Silence. The house felt empty, but something about it told me I wasn't alone. I tried to convince myself it was just an old house settling, but the creaks and whispers coming from upstairs told a different story. I moved cautiously toward the hallway, where the dim light faded into darkness. As I stepped closer, my eyes caught something strange, an old mirror hanging crooked on the wall. In the reflection, I could see the hallway behind me, but there was something off. I couldn't see myself clearly, like my image was blurred or distorted. My pulse quickened as I stepped away from it, avoiding my own gaze. The floor beneath me creaked with every step as I followed the delivery instructions on my phone. Deliver to the bedroom at the end of the hall. The hallway stretched out longer than it should have, the shadows pressing in from both sides. As I neared the last door, the air grew colder, and my breath came out in short, visible puffs. I reached for the doorknob with a shaky hand, hesitating before turning it. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a dark room with only a faint glow coming from an old lamp in the far corner. Sitting in a chair, facing away from me, was someone wrapped in a thick, tattered blanket. The figure didn't move, didn't react to my presence. Your package?" I said nervously, my voice cracking. No response. I stepped forward carefully and placed the box on a nearby table, hoping that was enough to fulfill my job. But as I turned to leave, a soft whisper floated through the air. "You shouldn't have come." My stomach dropped. I froze in place, my heart racing in my chest. Slowly, I glanced over my shoulder, but the figure in the chair was still facing away. Then, with an eerie slowness, the head tilted just enough for me to see the edge of a pale, expressionless face. I bolted out of the room, my pulse hammering in my ears. As I rushed back down the hallway, I could hear the faint sound of shuffling footsteps behind me, following at a steady pace. The walls seemed to close in, and every door I passed slammed shut on its own, trapping me in the narrow corridor. Panic took over, and I sprinted toward the exit, praying I could make it out before whatever was behind me caught up. I reached the front door, my trembling hands fumbling to grip the handle. I pulled hard, but the door wouldn't budge. It felt as if something on the other side was holding it shut. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breath came in ragged gasps. Behind me, the shuffling footsteps were getting closer, slow but deliberate, like whoever or whatever was in that chair upstairs was taking their time. I slammed my fist against the door, desperate for it to open, but the old wood wouldn't give. My eyes darted around the room, searching for another way out. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. On the wall next to the mirror, there was a small table with a row of old, dusty photographs. I stepped closer, my pulse quickening as I examined them. They were all of delivery drivers like me, standing in front of this very house, holding packages. My stomach tightened in horror when I realized their faces were scratched out, just like the ones in the living room. I took a shaky step back, my mind racing. How many people had come here before me, and where were they now? A low creak echoed from the hallway. I spun around, and there it was, the figure. It had moved. It now stood at the end of the hallway, wrapped in the same tattered blanket, but its face, oh God, its face. It was pale, hollow, and featureless, with deep, sunken pits where eyes should have been. That awful, whispery voice spoke again, only this time it was closer. "You shouldn't have come." The word sent ice down my spine. I stumbled backward, nearly knocking over the table, my eyes fixed on the figure. It didn't move toward me, but I could feel its presence closing in, suffocating me. The walls around me felt tighter, the air colder. Desperate, I turned back to the mirror on the wall, and what I saw made my blood freeze. In the reflection, the figure wasn't standing at the end of the hall. It was right behind me. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. My chest heaved, my mind screaming at me to get out. I grabbed the closest object I could find, a dusty chair, and hurled it at the front window. The glass shattered, and without thinking, I climbed through the jagged opening, ignoring the sting of broken glass cutting into my arms. I hit the frozen ground outside, scrambling to my feet and sprinting toward my truck. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I fumbled with my keys, yanking the door open and jumping inside, locking it behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely start the engine. When I finally did, I floored it, tires screeching as I sped away from that cursed house. As the house disappeared in my rearview mirror, I dared to glance back. There, standing at the edge of the driveway, was the figure, still wrapped in that blanket, watching me with those hollow, empty eyes. I drove for what felt like hours, the landscape blurring as I sped through the dark, empty streets. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The cold sweat that clung to my skin felt like it was never going to dry, and the image of that faceless figure haunted every corner of my vision. When I finally pulled over, I parked in the dim light of a gas station, unable to calm my shaking hands. My breath was ragged, and every little noise, every creak of the truck made me jump. I leaned my forehead against the steering wheel, trying to steady my thoughts, but all I could hear was that voice in my head. "You shouldn't have come." I checked my phone, the GPS showing I had completed the delivery, but I couldn't shake the thought that something wasn't right. The address, the photos, the feeling of being trapped in that house. It all felt wrong, like I had crossed into another world, one that I wasn't supposed to see. For a moment, I thought maybe I was just exhausted. Maybe it was all a nightmare brought on by the long hours and the isolation of the road. But then my phone buzzed. It was an email. I opened it slowly, my fingers still trembling. The subject line read, "Important. Package delivery confirmation." My heart stopped when I saw the attached image. It was a photo of the house, the very one I had just left. But in the picture there was no broken door, no empty rooms. The house was whole, untouched. But what caught my breath wasn't the house. It was the people in the image. There, standing at the front door, was a man, one I didn't recognize. His face was clear and visible, but his eyes were wrong. Hollow, just like the figure in the blanket. Beside him was another man, blurry and distorted, as if his image couldn't stay in focus. Behind them, in the darkened window, I could see a faint outline of something, or someone, just standing there, watching me. I swiped through the photos, each one showing different angles of the house, but in every single one, the people were there. Watching. Waiting. I tossed the phone aside, my heart pounding in my chest. The room seemed to spin, the walls closing in on me. Was I losing my mind? Had I truly seen what I thought I had? I shook my head, trying to clear the fog in my brain. Just then, I felt a chill creep across my skin, colder than anything I had felt that night. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and as I turned to glance at the rearview mirror, my blood ran cold. In the reflection, standing right behind me in the back seat, was the same man from the photo, the one with the hollow eyes, the one who had been waiting. I tried to scream, but the words stuck in my throat. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I didn't dare look back again. I just hit the gas, speeding off into the night, hoping, praying that whatever was following me would fade into the darkness. But deep down I knew it wouldn't. It would never stop. Story 3. I was the only one left in the office that night. The usual buzz of ringing phones and chatter had long faded, leaving behind an unsettling silence. The only sound was the faint hum of the vending machine and the distant ticking of the wall clock. I sat at my desk, staring at the screen, trying to finish up the last few reports before heading home. The glow from my monitor cast long shadows on the walls, making the empty cubicles around me feel even darker. I glanced up at the large office window overlooking the parking lot. It was nearly empty now, except for a few scattered cars belonging to the late workers like me. But something caught my eye. There, standing at the far end of the lot, was a figure. My stomach tightened. It was too dark to make out any details, but whoever it was stood completely still, facing the building. I rubbed my eyes, telling myself it was probably just someone waiting for a ride. But when I looked again, they were still there, standing in the exact same position. A strange feeling crept over me, but I tried to ignore it and focus on my work. A few minutes passed and curiosity got the better of me. I glanced up again, and my heart skipped a beat. The figure had moved. It was now standing closer under the dim glow of a parking lot light. I couldn't see their face, just a dark outline, but something about it felt wrong. The posture, the stillness, the way they seemed to be looking right at me. I swallowed hard and turned back to my screen, forcing myself to concentrate. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I was too tired and my mind was playing tricks on me. But when I looked up again, the figure had moved even closer. Now they were standing directly beneath my window. A cold chill ran down my spine, and I felt my hands trembling. I couldn't see a face, just a dark shape, too still, too silent. My pulse quickened, and for the first time that night, I wished I wasn't alone in the office. I tried to ignore it, but my hands were shaking as I reached for my coffee, now cold and bitter. The figure outside hadn't moved in minutes, just standing there under the flickering parking lot light. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it security? A coworker playing a joke? But deep down, something felt off. They were too still, too silent, and their face, I still couldn't see it. I forced myself to look away, focusing on the numbers on my screen, but they swam together in a blurry mess. Every instinct in me screamed to pack up and leave, but something held me in place. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was fear. I didn't know. My phone buzzed, making me jump. I grabbed it quickly, hoping for a distraction. It was a message from an unknown number. 3 simple words. Don't look away. My chest tightened. My first thought was that it had to be a prank. I glanced around the office, but it was empty. Rows of dark cubicles stretching out behind me, nothing but shadows and the hum of electronics. Slowly, I looked back out the window. The figure was gone. I let out a shaky breath, relief flooding through me, until I noticed movement in the reflection of my computer screen. My heart stopped. The figure was inside now. I spun around in my chair, but the office was empty. My breathing grew ragged as I scanned the room, my eyes darting to every dark corner. Was I imagining things? My mind was racing, my pulse hammering in my ears. I shook my head, trying to clear the growing fear in my chest. I stood up, forcing myself to move. I needed to check, just to be sure. Each step down the dimly lit corridor felt heavier, the air thick with silence. I reached the break room and peeked inside. Nothing. The supply closet, empty. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Just as I turned to head back to my desk, I heard it. Soft, deliberate tapping. It was coming from the window. I froze, my throat tightening. Slowly I turned back toward my desk, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The figure was back, pressed against the glass. Only now, it wasn't standing still. Its head tilted slightly, and though I still couldn't see its face, I knew it was staring right at me. I stood frozen, my eyes locked on the figure at the window. It was closer now, so close I could almost see its breath fogging up the glass. My chest tightened as I struggled to breathe, my heart hammering against my ribs. The figure's head tilted slowly to one side, and though its face was nothing but a blur, I could feel it staring right through me. I took a shaky step back, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. The sound echoed through the empty office, but the figure didn't react. It just stood there, motionless, as if waiting. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone again, desperate to call someone, anyone. But my fingers felt numb, and the screen was still blank. No signal. A sudden, sharp sound made me jump. A notification ping. My phone lit up with another message from the unknown number. This time, it was a photo. My stomach dropped as I opened it. It was a picture of me, sitting at my desk, right now. My breath caught in my throat. I looked around frantically, but there was no one in the office, no way anyone could have taken that picture. My pulse raced as I looked back at the window. The figure was gone. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my chair. My mind was screaming at me to leave, but my legs felt heavy, frozen in place. Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered, casting the office in brief moments of darkness. Each time the lights came back, the shadows seemed to shift, stretching further into the room. I took a step toward the exit, my instincts screaming at me to run. But then, I heard it. A whisper. Soft, almost like a breath against my ear. I'm inside. I whipped around, my throat dry and tight. The office was still empty, but the air felt different, heavier, as if something was pressing down on me. My feet moved on their own, dragging me toward the elevator. I slammed the button, willing the doors to open faster. As I waited, I glanced toward the glass doors leading to the hallway. There, standing just beyond the dim light, was the figure, closer than ever. Its head tilted again, its hand slowly pressing against the glass, leaving behind a smudged, shadowy imprint. The elevator dinged, and I practically threw myself inside, jabbing the button for the ground floor. The doors slid shut, and for a moment, I thought I was safe. But just before they closed completely, I caught one last glimpse. The figure was inside the office now. The elevator doors shut with a dull thud, and I collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath. My hands trembled as I pressed the button for the ground floor over and over, as if that would make the elevator move faster. A low hum filled the cramped space, but the usual comfort of it was gone, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to seep into my bones. I kept my eyes on the changing numbers above the door, counting down from the 10th floor. The ride felt agonizingly slow, each passing second dragging on forever. But just as I started to think I was finally getting out, the lights flickered again. The elevator shuddered and came to a sudden stop between floors. My heart leapt into my throat. I stabbed at the buttons frantically, my fingers slipping with sweat. The emergency light flickered weakly, casting long, shifting shadows across the small space. Then I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the elevator doors. I pressed myself against the back wall, my breath caught in my chest. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as if something was on the other side. I forced myself to stay still, not daring to move, not daring to breathe. Then the doors slowly slid open, not to the ground floor, but to darkness. Beyond the threshold, the hallway outside was shrouded in shadow, with only the faintest glow from a flickering light down the corridor. My eyes darted back and forth, searching for movement. I knew I shouldn't step out, but something about the blackness outside felt wrong. It wasn't empty. It was watching. I reached for my phone again, praying for a signal. The screen flickered to life with a new message. Step out. A lump formed in my throat, and I shook my head, whispering, "No, no way." Suddenly, the elevator lights snapped off completely, plunging me into total darkness. My pulse pounded in my ears as I scrambled to press the buttons again. The doors remained open, the darkness beyond stretching endlessly. I could feel it now. Something just beyond my sight, lurking in the black. And then, the whisper came again. I'm inside. My entire body froze. The air turned ice cold, and I could feel the faintest breath against the back of my neck. My shaking hand fumbled to turn on the phone's flashlight, and as the beam flickered to life, I aimed it toward the reflective surface of the elevator panel. In the dim glow, I saw it. A blurred, faceless figure standing right behind me. I screamed, lunging forward and slamming the closed door button repeatedly. The doors groaned, finally sliding shut. The elevator jolted to life, descending rapidly toward the ground floor. When it finally reached the bottom, the doors opened to the lobby, and I stumbled out, gasping for air. The security desk was empty, the lights dimmed, and the front doors were wide open. Without looking back, I ran outside into the cold night, not stopping until I reached my car. As I fumbled with my keys, my phone buzzed one last time. I hesitated before looking. The message was simple. See you tomorrow. I stared at the empty office building in my rear-view mirror, but something caught my eye. In the window of the 10th floor, the figure was still there, watching.